This is my midterm presentation for Restoration Ecology by Craig Garner. Restoration ecology is the process of assisting in the recovery of degraded, damaged, or destroyed habitat. Restoration ecology is important because much of the natural habitat in the U.S. has been lost or degraded. For instance, 53% of the wetlands, 95 to 98% of the mature forest, 70% of the riparian habitat, and all of the native prairie habitat has been lost. Restoration ecology got its start in the 1980s through the passage of the Clean Water Act. And there are three types of restorations. The first type is complete, which aims to restore the area back to its historic conditions. Ecological service restoration aims to restore the functions and processes and restore the ecological services of the habitat. And then experiential restoration aims to restore the site for the enjoyment of the public and improve the public perception and enjoyment of the site. It focuses a lot on aesthetics, public aesthetics, and public enjoyment. A novel community is a community that doesn't have a counterpart in nature. Novel communities are often found on highly disturbed sites, such as industrial and mining sites. And examples of the three different types of restoration projects. For complete, the Walnut Creek National Wildlife Refuge project aimed to restore the area back to its native prairie and savanna grassland habitat. The Restoring Wetlands for Carbon Storage in the Bavarian Alps had a goal to restore wetland habitat to restore the functions and processes of carbon sequestration and restore those ecological services. And the Cross Plains Ice Age National Refuge National Scientific Reserve project aimed to preserve the natural and cultural resources found on the reserve and improve public enjoyment through improved educational and interpretive activities and processes. Restoration plans include four components. The first component is the project goal. When you're setting up the project goal, you want to include all of the stakeholders in this process to ensure consensus on the project goal. You want to identify the type of habitat you want to restore on the site, and you want to identify a public use policy if there is going to be public use of the project site. You also want to gather background and historical information on the project site to learn more about how the site was used in the past and what habitat existed in the past. And you want to get current inventory of the flora and fauna on the site, the soils on the site, the hydrology of the site, the topography, and the climate of the site. The next component is the vision of the course of action or a course of action for the plan. In this section, you want to identify the specific activities that you're going to conduct to restore the site. You want to talk about or identify the how you're going to conduct those activities, where you're going to conduct those activities, and who's going to conduct those activities. And in this part of the plan, you want to identify a restoration design or blueprint of how you're going to implement all the different activities. And then you want to have a monitoring and management plan as part of the restoration plan. The monitoring plan is important so you can monitor the progress of the project and identify what works and doesn't work. And then the management plan identifies long-term management that is needed to ensure the project is a success. So how do you determine if a restoration project is a success? Well, there's 9 main elements. The first one is, does the site contain a species assemblage that's characteristic to the reference site? Does the site contain native species with only a few non-native species? Are the functions and processes that are required to sustain the habitat type present and functioning naturally on the site? Is the site have evidence of reproduction of species that are necessary to sustain and ensure that the habitat trajectory is moving forward so you can assure that you have the desired habitat type on the site? are the functions appropriate for the successional stage that's currently existing on the site? Is the restoration site integrated into the landscape, and are there flows of energy and nutrient transfer between the biotic and abiotic system? Have any potential threats from the surrounding and adjacent lands been eliminated or mitigated as much as possible? Is the site resilient to periodic stressors and weather events? And ultimately, is the site self-sustaining for long-term longevity? There are 7 challenges that face restoration project. The first is natural systems are dynamic systems. They're not static, so understanding what state they're in can be complicated, and what state you want to restore the habitat community back to can be complicated. Because these systems are very complicated, there's a lack of knowledge or understanding about these processes, about the abiotic and biotic relationships that exist and influence the habitat. Record keeping is also an issue. Historically, restoration projects have poor record keeping, and you want to keep detailed records on everything you do on the restoration project so you can help guide future restoration projects and help them avoid making the same mistakes you made. Legislation and policy is a challenge. Legislation that has a perception that we can destroy habitat because we can go restore it somewhere else is a bad state of mind, because many of the restored sites aren't as good as the sites of the habitat that got destroyed. Many of the areas have unique site histories. No site's exactly the same. No site responds to the same stressors or actions that you want to complete on the site. Many restoration sites can have conflicting goals. The various stakeholders could disagree on what habitat they want to restore on the site and how much public use they want to have on the site, so that can influence the success of the project. And then lack of funding can also be a challenge for restoration. Some of these large scale projects can be very expensive, and securing funding can be a challenge. But restoration projects also provide a lot of opportunities for society and in the natural world. One of those is they can enlarge natural preserves that are already existing on the landscape by restoring lands that are adjacent to these preserves. They can provide habitat links and corridors between patches of habitat on the landscape. You can restore remnant habitat that remains on the landscape. You can restore ecosystem processes and functions on sites that have limited impact and only have lost their processes and functions. You can restore those. You can have natural resource education by using volunteers in your project, and you can increase community involvement on the site by restoring a site and providing adequate public use on the site, and this will improve their enjoyment and understanding of the natural world. So here's 4 examples of different types of restoration projects, from large scale, small scale, experiment, and volunteers. Large scale with the longleaf pine restoration project. The goal of this project was to restore savanna longleaf pine community habitat. It was done by government agencies and environmental groups, and they did this by establishing goals for a complex of forest types, savanna grasslands, and they managed public use on the site. A small scale project was the erosion control project on University of Wisconsin-Madison campus. The goal of this project was to reduce erosion and maintain ground cover in the area. It was done by Rebecca Cagle, and she did this by redirecting foot traffic and stormwater runoff away from eroded areas, and they planted ground cover on these eroded areas. Analyzing mine tailings prior to restoration is an example of a project that included an experiment. The goal of this project was to study the potential to establish grass on mine tailings. It was done by the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and they did this by conducting greenhouse experiments using 9 different native grass species and different fertilizer mixtures to figure out which worked the best to grow native grass on mine tailings. And then the project that included volunteers was the Nashusha Grassland Project. The goal was to restore the native grassland prairie and connect the area to other habitats in the area. It was conducted by the Nature Conservancy with a group of volunteers. And they conducted this project by doing prescribed burns, removing non-native species, and planting native species on the site. So an ecological community is a group of interacting species that are living in the same place at the same time. They organize through 4 different ways. They organize through environmental tolerances. They organize through the ability to access the site, to travel to the site. They organize through species interactions, through predation and competition, and they organize through mutualistic relationships. And examples of that would be like mycorrhiza relationships with plants that grow in an area. Areas that have that, the plants will grow. Areas that don't have it, they won't grow. An ecological community dynamics is the change in the community, and this is driven by disturbances. And disturbance cycles interact with the community by creating different types of ecosystems by setting back succession through various stages. And the intermediate disturbance hypothesis states that species diversity is the highest when there's an intermediate disturbance. And this is because the intermediate disturbance creates various stages of succession in the habitat and creates various habitat which can support a higher diversity of species. And a continuous disturbance or routine disturbance is needed to hold an ecosystem in a successional state, i.e. fire. Fire is needed for the longleaf pine habitat community, so routine fire can hold that community in that successional state. And the bald eagle is an example of a keystone species that was not covered in lecture. It is a top predator in its habitat community. It feeds on smaller bird species and like ducks and geese, and it feeds on fish, and it also feeds on other dead animals. So it's a major player in the nutrient and energy cycle for its habitat, and removing it from that habitat would have grave consequences. An ecosystem is everything that makes up nature. It's the abiotic, it's the biotic, it's the water, it's the soil, it's the air, it's the climate, it's everything that makes up the natural world. And energy flows through an ecosystem by energy from the sun entering the ecosystem through heat. Some of this heat is lost in the ecosystem. Some of this heat is also absorbed in the biomass of animals. And the biogeochemical cycle is the nutrient and I guess it's the nutrient mineral cycle. It includes the hydrologic cycle, the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, and the phosphorus cycle. The hydrologic cycle is the water cycle that explains how water moves through the environment, the ecosystem. Moisture falls from the sky, from the clouds, as rain and snow in the mountains. This snow in the mountain melts, and the rain flows through the landscape. Some of this moisture infiltrates into the ground, becomes groundwater. Other parts of this enters the streams and the lakes and the rivers and flows to the ocean. And during this process, evaporation and evapotranspiration returns some of this moisture into the atmosphere, where it condenses in the clouds, and then returns as rain, which starts the process over. Patches are small isolated patches of habitat on the landscape that are surrounded by dissimilar habitats. And the ideal patch geometry is large patches of kind of roundish shape. Long, skinny patches aren't very good. Round patches have a lot of interior habitat. And you want these patches of habitat arranged on the landscape close enough so you can have corridors connecting these patches of habitat, so species can travel in between the patch habitats. There are three main reasons of why you want to use a reference system. And the first one is the reference systems provide information on what type of habitat currently exists in the area. So it can provide a baseline of what you want to restore your site to. It provides a visual representation of the desired restored system. So you can see the current habitat community that exists on the reference site and get a visual representation of what you want to restore your site to. And it allows you to evaluate the success of the restored project. Cons for using a reference system include there's no ideal state for the habitat community. It's ever changing. It's hard to determine what ecological state you should restore your project site to, or what ecological state you should use as the blueprint to restore your project to. And if the reference system is not natural, it could be a product of anthropogenic stressors, so you might not want to restore it back to that reference system. Project documentation is very important because it allows you to share information with other restoration projects and practitioners. It helps you gain knowledge about what activities work and what activities don't work, and it can help you avoid mistakes in the future on future restoration projects. There's a lot of good ways to document your project. You can document projects through field notes and take detailed notes about what you're doing, where you're doing it, how you're doing it, who's doing it. You can take photographs, pre-project, during project, and post-project photographs, and set up photo monitoring points to document the success of the project. And you can keep all of your invoices and receipts to document what you paid for, how much it cost, and who did the work. So you can learn about that and hopefully influence the success of future restoration projects. There are numerous ways research can be incorporated into restoration projects, and here's three examples. They can investigate remnant habitat to determine what habitat community exists on the landscape and give you information about what you need to restore your site to. They can investigate the historical community that existed on the landscape, what type of community existed and what animals existed on the landscape. And research can also set up experiments on your site to experiment. For instance, what's the best way to establish native species on your site? So you can set up different experiments on your site with different native species and maybe different fertilizers and figure out which one responds the best. And you can use that information to improve the restoration success of your project. Reading the Catsby paper made me think a lot about using historical information to set up my restoration goals. It provided a lot of good information about historical use of the area, what type of habitat existed in the area, the type of hydrology, the soils, the agriculture that existed in the area, how the indigenous people interacted with the habitat in the natural environment, and how they managed the habitat in the area. So gaining and gathering all of this information is extremely important when you're setting up your restoration project and deciding what your restoration goal is going to be. You need to incorporate all of this historical knowledge that you can gather about the landscape and your general area of your project. There are three types of data you want to collect when you're doing a site inventory. You want to collect data on the flora and fauna that exist on the site. You want to collect the soil type and texture, and you want to collect information about the hydrology and climate. Then all of this information, the climate, topography, hydrology, and soil, is important because it dictates what type of habitat you can restore the site to. And you can learn about these in various ways without ever setting foot on the restoration site. You can learn about the soils by using the NRCS Web Soil Survey website to gather information about the soils on the site. You can use topographical maps to learn about the topography. You can use the NOAA website to learn about the climate in the area and get information on rainfall and temperature. And then The reason that biological and socioeconomic data is important in restoration planning is all of this information guides the success of your project. So knowing the biological information, what exists on the site, what used to exist on the site, um, and how that site was used is extremely important. Socioeconomic data on regulations and policies that might limit what you can do in your restoration project is important, but also how the local indigenous people and local people use the site and manage the site is very important in your restoration planning, because you want to include all of that into your planning and project so it can be a successful project. And this includes historical information about how the site's been used in the past, the different practices that were used on the landscape from agriculture, what type of agricultural crops were grown, how long were they grown, um, what existed historically and how it's changed through time is all important when you're designing your restoration project. You can avoid misguided management on your restoration project by using local knowledge. The local people on the ground that have lived within the habitat have the most knowledge about how the site's been used, the habitat on the area, and how they use the site. So incorporating local knowledge can help you avoid mismanagement. There are 5 common human impacts to natural areas. This includes erosion, pollution, stormwater runoff, litter, impacts to wildlife from domestic animals, and any commercial corridors, utility lines that pass through your project area. And the best way to plan for these in your restoration project is to develop a public use plan. So you can identify where you're going to allow public access. You can identify trails on the site. You can provide trash cans and receptacles so people can throw away their garbage, and you can limit dogs to leashes and control how people are using your restoration site. Adaptive management is the process of being flexible or changing your management techniques based on responses from the management. It fills the gap through scientists and restoration practitioners by identifying a project goal. It identifies actions to be implemented and sets up a model to test those actions to see if they work. It can conduct small-scale experiments to see what works best, and you can use this data and implement that information into implementing your larger scale restoration project, and hopefully make it more of a success. And this is a cyclic circle, so you can continue this. If you learn something on your restoration project, you can feed it back into the model and get new information and make your project more successful. There are 5 ways you can engage volunteers in your restoration project. This includes holding and conducting public meetings to provide information about your project and solicit input from the public. You can hold workshops where you get more into the weeds and talk about the specific goals and the actions you're going to implement in the restoration project and get input from the stakeholders and the public. You can solicit comment letters from the public. You can also take the public and stakeholders out on site to give them tours of the project site and talk about the restoration project. And you can engage the public through the environmental impact statement document and get comments on the draft report of that EIS document. 5 practices for working with volunteers include using volunteers to help clean up the site, pick up litter from the site. You can use volunteers to do weed control or remove invasive species from the site. You can use volunteers to collect data on the site for water quality data. You can use volunteers to do wildlife observation counts. You can use volunteers to create interpretive and information signs that post at the site. And they can also, if they have facilities where they can be stationed, they can also answer questions from the public using the site about rules and regulations, where they're allowed to access the site. And you can also use volunteers to create informational brochures or posters that can be displayed at community meetings and other venues where you can promote the project and talk about the benefits of the project. There are numerous ways local people can help with ecosystem management and restoration projects. So local people, they have the historic knowledge on the area. They know what's happened in the past, how it's been used. They know the past land use, how it's been managed. Has it been in agriculture, timber production, or is it natural habitat? They know about the traditional practices that the local community uses, whether it's burning the forest or not burning the forest or other practices that might be taking place in the area. And they have socioeconomic knowledge about what's the perception of the people in the area about the area. Do they want to have public access on the site? What type of habitat do people prefer to see on the site and use? What type of habitat do they like to recreate in? And what type of habitat they just generally enjoy. There's there's four main federal legislation that impact restoration. The first is the Safe Harbor Act of 1899, which regulated dredge and discharge into waters of the U.S. There's the Clean Water Act that regulated dredge and fill in navigable waters in the U.S. and established a policy of no net loss. There's the Army Corps of Engineers that regulates dredge and fill in navigable waters of the U.S. through their 404 permit. That permit is required for any project that fills or dredges or impacts wetlands or aquatic systems. And then there's the Endangered Species Act that protects endangered species and prevents actions from restoration projects that could negatively impact any endangered species that's found on the site. There are three main steps to determine where to place development. The first is to avoid all impacts to wetlands and aquatic systems. The second option is to minimize these impacts to aquatic and wetland systems. And the third is to mitigate for any unavoidable impacts to wetlands and aquatic systems. And a mitigation bank is an area that has been restored and its functions have been restored to provide the so mitigation banks are areas that have been restored to provide mitigation credits for the required compensatory mitigation for the approved impacts. There's four options to mitigate for impact. You can restore a previously existing wetland or aquatic system. You can enhance the function and processes and provide a functional lift to an existing wetland or aquatic system. You can establish or create a new wetland system or aquatic system, or you can preserve a wetland or aquatic system. There are 6 steps to determine how much mitigation is required for your project. The first step is the loss type. There are 3 types of habitat. It's type A, type B, type C. Type A is highly connected habitat that provides a lot of functional processes. Type B is disconnected habitat type, and type C is like man-made lakes and habitat such as that. The second step is priority category. So there's primary, secondary, and tertiary. Primary category is for habitat that's on state and federal lands. This includes river habitat and tidal habitat and essential fish habitat. Type B is uncommon but vulnerable habitat. This includes things like Carolina Bay. And then type C is habitats that don't fall within the primary or secondary habitat categories, and these are habitats such as bottomwood heartlands. The third step is existing condition. what condition is the site in. So it can be fully functional, partially impaired, impaired, or fully impaired. So fully functional is the site is functioning as it should in natural conditions. Partially impaired is partial or complete loss of one or more functions, but these functions can be restored through natural processes. Impaired is the loss or partial loss of one or more functions, but cannot be restored through natural processes. And fully impaired is the complete loss of all functions, and extensive restoration will be needed. The next step is duration. This is how long that the impact is expected to last. Is it 10 years, 15 years, 20 years? How long is the impact going to last? The next step is dominant impact. This can be clearing if you're removing vegetation. It can be draining the wetland. It can be dredging in a wetland. It can be filling a wetland if you're trying to raise topography. It could be impounding or pooling water, stopping the flow, or it can be shading a wetland primarily through overpasses over wetland areas. And the last component is cumulative impacts, which takes into account past, present, and any foreseeable impacts that might be in the area. There's two options to mitigate for impacts. You can either buy credits from a mitigation bank if they have the appropriate type of habitat credits and the appropriate amount of credits, or you can conduct a restoration project that generates the required mitigation credits for the approved impacts. And there are 6 factors that determine the amount of mitigation credits that can be generated from a restoration project. The first factor is the net improvement that you're providing on the site. Are you providing a functional lift to the habitat that exists on the site? You also can get mitigation credits for the amount of upland buffer that you provide on the site. The more upland buffer you provide, the more mitigation credits that you can get. You get credits for the timing of the restoration. Is the restoration being conducted before the impact is happening, at the same time the impact is happening, or after the impact is happening? You get more credits if you conduct the restoration prior to the impacts or at the same time of the impacts. You get credits based on the temporal loss. How long is the site going to take to achieve the habitat type that you want to replace the impacted habitat? So how long is it going to take for the restoration project to replace the impacted habitat? You've got the kind category that looks at, are you replacing in-kind habitat or out-of-kind habitat? If you're replacing out-of-kind habitat, you get no mitigation credit. If you're doing in-kind habitat, you can get a mitigation credit. And then the last factor is location. And this deals with, is the restoration project in the same watershed or drainage? If you're in the same 8-digit hydrologic unit as the impacted habitat, you get more mitigation credits for those types of projects. So was the development of the Honeycutt Creek Public Shopping Center, that's the typo, that should be shopping center, a success? I do not believe it was a success, and 5 pieces of evidence that I noticed in the video is that the wood duck boxes have not been installed, the public access components have not been installed, the drainage issue with the wetland has not been resolved, and the erosion process at the drainage site where the wetland drains into the stream has not been resolved. That's still eroding. The tree planting has kind of a mixed success in the wetland. It could be successful, but it really hasn't hit the successional stage as a mature bottomwood hardland forest. And then the stream restoration, portions of it look successful, but overall I would say it's not a success. For one reason, it was conducted at the bottom of the stream. It should have been conducted at the headwaters, and because the headwaters was not restored, these flashy high water events still occur. And I suspect that's the reason why you're seeing a lot of erosion along the banks at the bottom of the stream where the restoration project was conducted. So I would say that either the restoration project was poorly implemented, or they picked a poor location, and the development has not been a success. Thank you, and that's the end of my presentation.